Today we're going to be talking about voting, who votes and why. I assigned 2 readings for class today. Both of them are fairly short. The first one is very hard, I think. The Downes one, An Economic Theory of Democracy. A bit of background on Downes. He's one of those lucky bastards who wrote a dissertation, and that dissertation just happened to get published like in its whole thing, in terms of he published the Economic Theory of Democracy, and then it became like one of the most influential works in all of political science, and then he just got to like ride on that for the rest of his life. Damn him to hell. He's dead now, I shouldn't say that. But very important work. I know you have questions about Downes. We're going to dive into Downes a lot in this lecture, but I'm going to skip over the question part, and you guys can ask me any confusing questions after we have a little discussion. What is Downes arguing in this reading? Kind of. Information is important. Rational is more important to his theory. Expand on that a little bit more. Why are voters rational? Benefit is an important thing there. Let's expand on that a little bit more. Benefit. A voter is rational because they seek benefits when they go to the ballot box. Why are they seeking benefits? Like, what do they get out of voting? This doesn't just apply to the reading. I'm asking you. You go to vote. What do you seek when you vote? Representation, that's one thing you could seek. It's just representation and self-interest. The 2 ends of the spectrum. Societal positioning. There are a few benefits that you get from this. Basically, he formalizes voting as this kind of cost-benefit calculation. He applies economics to political science. You might say, well, it's all social science. It's all, kind of interwoven. And I would say, you're right, but these distinctions used to really matter. Essentially, he says that rational citizens weigh the expected utility of each party's victory. So basically saying, I receive benefit, utility, through one party winning in this way, so I will receive this benefit from them, or I will receive this benefit from the other party, and they weigh those benefits against the cost of participation in an election. It's as simple as that. And by simple, I mean I'm going to have an equation later in this that formalizes that. The issue is that the probability of any single vote determining an election is so infinitesimally small, the expected benefit that you get out of voting is essentially zero. Basically, elections are rarely decided by one vote. Almost never, particularly on the national scale. So if you come to the voting booth as a self-interested actor, only voting for yourself, your perceived benefit, mathematically, is zero. Because your vote individually doesn't matter. Votes only matter in aggregate. This is what he talks about in the terms of like a paradox of voting, and I have a whole slide on this later. So we're going to move on to what I think is the easier paper to digest. I want you guys to think about this, and we're going to dive into some of the representation literature when it comes to voting that I think is really cool. This is from the scholars Stauffer and Fraga. Katie Stauffer used to be a faculty in our Department of Political Science. She's pretty cool. She's from like 2 hometowns over from where I am. She teaches at UGA now. What are Stauffer and Fraga saying in this piece? They basically say that there are contextual factors that moderate how this gender gap works. Women have consistently voted more than men since like the 1930s. But this pattern isn't uniform across elections. They basically find that the turnout gap expands during presidential elections and shrinks during midterms, and occasionally can reverse. There are certain circumstances when men decide to get off the couch and go vote more than women do. The gap then is smallest in the most competitive congressional districts, suggesting that this context really matters. Basically, when elections are close, when they are very competitive, and when mobilization then is very high, they're trying to get people out to vote a whole bunch more, men's turnout rises sharply more than women. Basically, it's easy to mobilize men to almost outvote women in these competitive races. So, the idea that women vote more is a little bit more complicated. This is more complicated by the second aspect of this study. What is the second aspect? They talk about gender, and they talk about what they're saying is that race shapes the gender turnout gap. Intersectionality is beyond how movements can interact with each other. It also moderates how identities interact with each other, and that informs behavior as a whole. I'm gonna, stand up here and talk about intersectional theory with you guys for a second. It is not the boogeyman that a lot of right-wing people will have you believe. It's just the idea that identity compounds, and this can apply to any identity. Myself, as a person who grew up in a pseudo-Amish community, applies to and compounds with my identity as a graduate student, right? Potentially those interact, and it needs to be accounted for. There's not going to be a widespread study of that at all, but in this study, race and gender compound with each other, okay? So what they're saying is that in heavily white districts, the gender gap is narrow and even negligible, but in racially diverse or majority-minority districts, the gap widens substantially. Specifically among Black and Latino women, the racial gap is, gender gap is much higher within their racial subgroup. Now, Stauffer and Fraga do note that this could be due to the fact that in these majority-minority districts, those races are rarely competitive, which we've already shown that across all racial subgroups, when the election is not competitive, women outvote men. They vote more habitually. And finally, this is the most interesting finding to me. Whether or not a candidate running for office in an election is themselves a woman does not impact the gender gap significantly in any of their models. You would think that if a woman is running for office, that might prompt, women to go out and vote more, potentially for them, trying to seek descriptive representation or symbolic representation of their group. Or maybe the inverse is true. Maybe your Andrew Tate types get a bunch of men mobilized and they're like, we can't have these quote-unquote females running the country, so we need to outvote them, and you would see the the gender gap diminish. But really, they find the mitigating factors in their models are competitiveness of a district and racial makeup, and not the actual gender identity of the candidate running. I can tell from all of your very, glowing faces that you find this as fascinating as I do. This is crazy, guys. Yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up. Heck yeah. Well, let's get into the meat and the potatoes of the lecture here. Today we're going to get at a question that's kind of at the core of democratic behavior. Who participates in elections, and why do they do that silly thing? Voting, in essence, is both a civic act and a choice that is shaped by cost, by benefits, and by social context. These three pillars inform why someone votes: cost, benefit, social context. We're going to explore a few theoretical models that explain voter turnout, especially rational choice and spatial models, even though they're a little outdated. I think they're a good foundation. And examine how these models interact with real-world inequalities and inequities that then prompt voter turnout and voter disenfranchisement, or voters deciding not to vote. So let's start at the beginning. I talked about this paradox of voting that Downs talks about. From a purely instrumental perspective, voting is an irrational act. The time and effort required outweigh the infinitesimally small possibility of changing an election's outcome. And this is what Anthony Downs talks about when he talks about the paradox of voting. Yet, democracies constantly see millions of people participate in elections. This paradox pushes us to think beyond narrow self-interest. If we were all voting just for ourselves, voting wouldn't matter at all. It doesn't make sense for us to do that because mathematically, you don't matter in an electoral system. Only in aggregate do you matter. Then we move to understand this through social norms, identity, and expressive motives. And those supplement these material incentives for wanting to go vote. And they continue to explain why people vote despite the odds being against them, just mathematically. So, let's start with some basic rational choice models. Individuals act when benefits exceed costs. Voting under a rational choice model is a utility maximizing action. Benefits that a voter might receive from participating in an election could be a policy goal that a candidate aligns with. It could be perhaps the candidate reflects their own minoritized identity or might help their minoritized group in some kind of meaningful way, or through expressive satisfaction. That's basically gloating, right? I did my civic job as an American citizen, and now I have a fancy sticker that says I voted and you don't because you're lame. That's expressive satisfaction. Costs for voting then, right? Remember, the benefits have to outweigh the costs, include time, the time it takes to go vote, information, you don't know everything about an election before you enter in, so it takes a little bit of work to get that out, and effort. Frankly, it's a bit of a chore to go vote. And participation then in an election reflects this perceived utility. If you think through this process and you say, okay, the benefits of voting in this election outweigh the costs, then I will vote. However, as we see from our picture of our friend here who is very drunk and sad, the actual calculus of this is a little bit more complicated. We're going to do some math, everybody. Not actually. It's the fake math, the one with letters instead of numbers. A rational model for the calculus of voting can be described through this equation here. V equals PB plus D greater than C. What does this mean, you might ask? Why are you assaulting my eyes with this terrible thing? Well, first, V is the proxy for the probability that the voter will turn out. This is whether or not you're going to vote. That's on the left side of this equation here. Think of that as a 0, you're not voting, a 1, you do vote. Let's talk about this term PB here. P is that infinitesimally small possibility that your vote is the deciding vote in an election, right? Think about it as the very small probability that in a nationwide election where 80 million people vote or whatever, you are the 40 millionth and one vote that decides that election. That is that probability. And that modifies the perceived benefit of voting. Remember those benefits that we talked about? That's, identity, policy, and, gloating. Those then are added to D, which is citizen duty, the psychological benefit of voting. That's basically, I will feel guilty if I don't vote, or I have been educated from some asshole sociology or political science professor that I need to go vote. It's my civic duty to do so. And, maybe I get some kind of, good feeling afterwards, and I have that little sticker beyond the gloating side of things, and, I did my job. So, for you to vote, the benefit that you perceive modified by the probability knowing that your vote doesn't matter, plus the duty you feel to go vote, has to be greater than the perceived cost of voting. Only if this term is greater than the cost of voting does this equal 1. Only if this term is greater than the cost of voting does this mean you will vote. I tell you all this because we're going to have a discussion at the end of class here about whether this actually reflects what goes on in people's heads. I love political science. I don't know if it loves me, but I love it. I do this for a living. Sometimes I think we think a little bit too much about these things. I think this is a great example of that. Does this all make sense? Great. All right, let's move on. Spatial models. Spatial models depict politics as a line of ideological positions, the x-axis here. Voters have an ideal point along this continuum, and they choose the candidate nearest to it. Candidates, anticipating this, converge towards a median voter whose position secures a majority. However, modern polarization, as well as partisan sorting and asymmetries in who turns out for elections, disrupt this view of elections. Basically, these spatial models, in particular median voter theorem and Downesian views of elections, really fit how elections looked in the mid-20th century. Now things are a little bit more complicated. We'll get into that, but first I want to describe what's happening here. This is a schematic representation of a very simple spatial theory of voting. A voter, let's say they're right here at the ideal point, has a preference on some policy. Let's say that this shows tax policy, okay? And this is, the voters' preferences are represented through a utility function under this curve here. So, tax policy. If the tax policy is set over here, they receive no utility from that. If it's set up here, they receive no utility for that. The ideal point is the highest point of this parabola, okay? Then you have candidates that position themselves. So say the status quo here is represented by the incumbent, the person already in office. That is their position. And the alternative, let's say that's the challenger in an election, has a position here. The voter sitting at the ideal point probably is going to vote for the alternative rather than the status quo candidate, simply because the utility of the alternative's position on a policy area is closer to the height of their ideal point. I said a bunch of jargon there. Do we have any questions? Come on, guys. I'd expect you to be jumping out of your seats about this stuff. This is the height of fun. So let's talk about the Downesian framework in detail. Downes's framework formalized the analogy between politics and markets. I'm going to try to put on my economist hat here. Ugh. Feels greasy. Just as businesses seek profit, parties seek votes. Just as consumers buy products, voters choose preferred policies. This logic treats elections then as mechanisms for preference aggregation and policy moderation. Remember, you as an individual voter don't matter. In a group of voters, that's when you matter. And what did we learn about public opinion formation? It happens in aggregate and moderates toward the center. This is the idea that underlies all of this. Policy competition then, according to Downes, mirrors market behavior. All of the business majors in here should be going, oh yeah, that makes sense. But this model is a little oversimple. Real voters often lack clear preferences. What did Converse say about this? What did Converse say about voters' formed values and preferences? It was last class? Yes. Thank you. They don't have concrete preferences a lot of the time. And real parties pursue goals that are different than just what the voters want. They might be ideological, they might be specific policies, or might try to mobilize a group specifically, rather than just sheer vote seeking. So let's view this spatial model. Again, this is basically the same spatial model that I just showed you, but a little bit more simplified for my purposes here, okay? So you have voter A at this ideal point. They have three candidates they're choosing from. Candidate C is all the way over at the left here. Candidate B, we're going to ignore the fact that it says C and B, C and C. We're just going to say that this is candidate C, and this is candidate B over here, okay? Candidate C is all the way on the left, candidate B is all the way on the right, and voter A has this preference right here. Well, they're going to choose candidate A, right? They're at their ideal point. Candidate A rarely exists in an election, especially when you only have two candidates to choose between, okay? Because we have two parties. And remember, parties are not neutral actors. So say voter is an enlightened centrist in the middle of the political spectrum here, an independent voter, a true independent, you might say. I don't believe they exist, but for the sake of arguing, let's say they do. The distribution for the Democratic Party's potential policies that they support is over here, and the distribution of the potential policies a Republican candidate might support are over here. What's happening here is a primary election, right? We have chosen candidate C because they represent the median voter of the Democratic Party in the primary. And we have chosen candidate B because they represent the median voter's position within the Republican Party. But that leaves most voters who are unaffiliated completely unrepresented. So does public opinion really aggregate to the middle? Really, public opinion and voter preference is not this normally distributed curve. In a polarized society, it is what we would call as bimodal. Two humps in the curve. They center around the parties. And that looks like this. The theoretical median assumes universal informed participation. That does not happen in practice. In practice, turnout biases, where you have older, wealthier, and more educated citizens voting at higher rates, will often skew the actual median voting position further to the right. Beyond that, as I was saying, primaries will often be driven by ideologically more pure, extreme ideas and pull these preferences apart. Here you see this happen over time. This is from the Pew Research Center in this figure. Voters also face incomplete information and rely on their effective, with an A, attachments rather than policy distance between the candidates to evaluate who they're going to vote for. Remember when I talked about affective polarization last class? Affective ideas. And beyond that, identity and affect weaken spatial assumptions. Your own personal identities might also divorce you from how these median voter or spatial models interpret vote choice. Does this make sense? Great. So I'm going to toot my own horn here for a second. Socioeconomic status, as I see it, remains the most powerful predictor of voter turnout. I study socioeconomic status for a living. I argue that it is the most powerful predictor for everything that happens. But specifically in the literature about voter turnout, it seems to be a constant predictor. Essentially, education enhances political literacy and efficacy. You know more about politics when you have the chance to be educated. Income provides time and resources so you can go vote. Age also builds the habit of participation. Old people vote at much higher rates than young people do, partially because they don't have kids in the house, partially because they're not working, and then that falls off after a time. It's kind of like a curve. You get more and more people voting as they get older, and they get to a certain age and they stop giving a shit because they're going to be dead in a year. Race, ethnicity, and community institutions mediate these effects through mobilization networks and, of course, historical barriers to participation. We've talked about that a lot during the civil rights unit. The result is this kind of participatory inequality in elections. Those with the most socioeconomic advantage, the richest, the most educated, the oldest, tend to exert a disproportionate influence over policy outcomes just because they vote more. A little bit of local information. Does anybody know what this building is? It is in Columbia, South Carolina, this one. Nobody hangs out on North Main much, do they? You go to the Greek Fest at all? It's right across from there. Nobody does a lot of volunteerism. This is Transitions Homelessness Center. I had one of the most enlightening conversations I have ever had about politics outside of this building at 5:30 in the morning when I was going to serve breakfast in there with a bunch of people. They talked about the election. This was right before the 2022 midterms. In very educated terms, they know what's going on, the homeless people there, but they could not vote either because they could not get to a polling place or because they did not have a permanent residence at which to register to vote, which you need in South Carolina. If these people could vote, politics would look very different. Very different. You guys should also volunteer there. They do really good stuff there. Institutional determinants of turnout. So institutions structure the ease and meaning of participation. We're going to skip through here real quick. Strict registration laws requiring voter ID, weekday voting rather than weekend voting or holiday voting, basically requiring people to get out of work, and limited polling access will suppress turnout. By contrast, if you automatically register people to vote, if you allow early voting or voting by mail, or same-day options for voting that are at lower cost, say you had a holiday for election day, or didn't require some form of voter ID, will lower costs for voting. Compulsory voting obviously will increase election turnout. Compulsory voting is a requirement that you vote. I include a picture of Crocodile Dundee here because Australians are required to vote. Again, I have to be creative with the images for these slides when I don't have like a boring figure or something. And also, look at him. Look at him. He's got his friend right there. International comparisons to the United States reveal that when voting is made easier or mandatory, participation rises dramatically. Whether or not this is a good thing is up for debate. Would you rather have everybody vote and have most of the people who vote not actually care? Or would you rather have people who really care voting a lot and they're the ones who are actually influencing politics? There's a happy medium between the two, but there are arguments against compulsory voting. Institutional design therefore mediates how effective a voting system is at getting people out to vote. It mediates the rational calculus of participation, shaping not just whether citizens can vote, but how they think about whether they want to vote. A lot of citizens vote not to influence outcome, not only to influence outcomes of an election, but also to express their identity or to carry out some sense of duty that they have for voting. Voting fulfills a social or psychological need, and it can manifest in terms of belonging to a community, affirming some kind of moral norm. Maybe in your family it's very frowned upon not to vote, or simply feeling good about yourself and civic participation. I know many of you are fairly young. Many of you might not have voted yet, but I'd like to think that if you do, you leave the voting booth and think, I did a good thing here, and then go get, like, I don't know, a coffee or something. Once established, the act of voting becomes habitual. The literature bears this out. If people start voting, it's hard to get them to stop. It's like cocaine. These motivations, though intangible, are central to turnout. They transform voting from this cost-benefit calculation that we've talked about into a socially embedded behavior. This, perhaps, is a much more reasonable and accurate view of how and why people vote. Social pressure is a big deal. So what are the outcomes of some people voting and other people don't? Well, because voters differ from non-voters in resources, ideology, and policy preferences, turnout inequalities produce biases in policy outputs themselves. Voters and non-voters are different types of people. Elected officials respond to who votes to some degree, right? Not those who abstain from voting. I disagree with this position, but we'll get into that in the discussion. This pattern can concentrate political power among those who are engaged in politics and reinforce that social stratification that I talked about. That's why those people lining up outside the homeless shelter are not as well represented as you and I are. That means that the question of who votes is inseparable from a question about who governs. Now, don't get yourselves all gassed up here viewing, oh, well, I vote, so I must be really influencing politics. Hold on now. Remember, your individual vote doesn't matter. It's only an aggregate. But still, the aggregate of people who do vote matter more than the aggregate of people who don't vote for policy. Equalizing participation, then, is not just a procedural concern, but a substantive one. It determines who shapes policy outcomes in a democracy. Oh, we're going to have so much time for our discussion. I'm so excited. So while rational and spatial models clarify the logic of participation, they often oversimplify human behavior in practice. They don't really reflect how people actually act in the moment. Emotions, group identities, and cognitive shortcuts shape political decisions as much as policy distance or cost-benefit calculations do. I'm sorry to the business majors in the class, but markets aren't everything. You can't apply them to everything. Sorry, Anthony Downs. Most citizens lack information to make perfectly rational spatial choices. By most, I mean all. Nobody has enough information about an election to make a perfectly rational decision, because you're not going to know whether or not you wake up one day and your congressperson has just gone completely insane and decides, I'm going to start supporting legislation that's, not what people voted me for. John Fetterman in Pennsylvania is a great example of this. He was elected as this massive progressive and suffered a lot of things at the end of his election. He had a stroke and some serious mental health stuff, and came back and is basically a Republican now. It's very strange. Real behavior then blends logic, rational thinking along with identity. Again, identity, for the people in the room who don't necessarily feel that they have one in the sense of scholarship, you do. It's anything that you are. So big takeaways here. Voting behavior emerges from incentives, norms, and structures. Rational and spatial models reveal the logic of choice, but socioeconomic and institutional factors reveal the context in which people vote. Who votes and who doesn't shapes the direction and legitimacy of a government. In the next lecture, we're going to expand beyond voting and talk about other forms of political participation like protest, volunteering, and activism, and explain how people engage in democracy beyond voting